Okay, and it looks like we are right at noon, 12 o'clock Eastern, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your interest in this first CTSC-sponsored Big Data webinar. It's the first in a series of webinars that Dr. Craig Jarrett and I will be hosting. So please stay tuned if you like today's webinar. Stay tuned for more like it in the coming months. So I'm Dr. Ashley Hughes. I'm an associate professor and research informaticist at Metro Health and the Population Health and Equity Research Institute. And Craig, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and get us started?
Yeah, I'm Craig Jarrett. I'm a physician. I work 20% clinically in cardiothoracic surgery at university hospitals. I'm a clinical informatics fellow at Metro Health, also then stationed at university hospitals, and I'm a PhD candidate, clinical informatics at Case Western. All right.
And today we're going to be covering the Cosmos database basics. There will be other topics in future webinars. Go ahead, Craig, with our agenda for today.
So today we're going to talk about the future big data webinars we plan to have, and then we're also planning an Epic Cosmos Datathon. Well, then Ashley is going to jump into introduction of Epic Cosmos database. I'll discuss how to get access and log in. Ashley will talk about creating dashboards and projects. I'll then take over and discuss how to better understand the underlying data in Cosmos by exploring the data dictionary and data encyclopedia. And then Ashley and I will together show you how to perform simple queries. Ashley's going to focus on the theoretical with a slideshow, and then I'll do a live demo. We'll leave 10 minutes at the end for questions, but feel free to raise your hand. You can definitely interrupt us. You can throw a question in the chat that is being monitored, and we can answer any questions in real time. So the future big data webinars we are planning to have include one in November. It'll be the fourth quarter webinar. It's at the same time on a Wednesday. Stay tuned for additional emails coming out where you can sign up for that. At that webinar, we're planning to use this first webinar, which is Epic Cosmos database. We're going to discuss more intermediate queries in Cosmos, specifically complex queries in Slicer Dicer using longitudinal data and advanced logic. We'll look deeper into the data visualization options that are available in Slicer Dicer. There's a new feature we'd like to introduce at that time. It's called background query processing, where you can do your query and save it and kind of walk away from the computer and not have to sit there until it finishes. We're talking millions of patients. So some of these queries take, 10, 15, 20 minutes. And if you really dig in deep. And then lastly, we'll talk about how do you export data, tables, and figures from Slicer Dicer. We then plan to, in December, have the first multi-institutional Epic Cosmos Datathon, and this is going to be open to all CTSC members, and we'll discuss how to get access and how to sign up for that also. That's planned on December 7th. It's an all-day event at the Wolstein Research Building on Case's campus. And then the Big Data webinar in the first quarter of 2025, we'll send additional information. We will most likely jump into the Epic Cosmos database kind of advanced. We may include what's called the Data Science Virtual Machine, which has access to row-level data, but stay tuned for details on that. Ashley's going to take it over and show us the introduction to Epic.
Great. Thanks so much, Craig. Yeah, so there are a lot of events upcoming. Please make sure to mark your calendars. There'll be some save the dates coming soon, especially for that Datathon, first ever Cleveland area Datathon. And actually, it's more than Cleveland area, right? It's northern region of Ohio Datathon. But, before we get too deep into even some of our simple queries, there are some basics that we need to cover in terms of what exactly is Cosmos and what it can and cannot do. So Cosmos is a combination of data contributed by, tens of thousands of clinics and thousands of hospitals who are all using the Epic electronic health record system. So to date, even though this number changes daily, to date, this contains 274 million patient data, unique patients, that is, with more than 13 billion encounters. And that includes both telehealth as well as face-to-face visits. And if your interests happen to be more on the clinical or health services research side, you can also perform some queries related to physicians or types of orders that were entered. If it lives in the electronic health record, and can be de-identified, oftentimes it will be in Cosmos. So that actually leads really nicely into that next slide, where there are a few basics that we need to understand in terms of what Cosmos is and what Cosmos is not. And that kind of tells us more of what we can and cannot do within the Cosmos database. So Cosmos is a very large, limited de-identified HIPAA compliant data set. What does that mean? It means that the data has been de-identified, which to researchers, it's a great resource, and clinicians as well who want to just know basics about a disease or prevalence, as we'll get into later. But it also means that when you're performing a query, even for publication purposes, you don't necessarily need IRB approval, as does not constitute human subjects research. Because Epic is such a widespread, widely used electronic health record system, Cosmos has done comparisons of their data to US Census data, and this is actually representative of US demographics. So it's a great population health research data set that is, you can do simple queries right at your fingertips. And I did mention IRB earlier, in part because this data is absolutely 100% publishable. In fact, major publication outlets such as New England Journal of Medicine have even published queries that were performed in Cosmos. All right, so transitioning over to what Cosmos is not. Definitely not data for sale. And as I mentioned, because it is in fact de-identified, there is not a way to re-identify this data. So it does limit some of the types of research questions that you can ask. You can't necessarily link or easily export some of the data to link it with other data sets. But we'll talk about some of these things as we progress. So you can go ahead to the next slide. I think it's back over to you, Craig.
Yes,
Yeah.
so I will take over and discuss how to get access and then to actually log in. So to get access, there's 5 steps that you have to take. Most people, or at least some people, can probably skip the first 2. So if you're at an institution that's contributing data to Cosmos, you're all set with step 1. You can skip step 1. If you're not at an institution contributing data to Cosmos, you should partner with a clinician at one of those institutions to vet your idea as well as help you connect with the people at those institutions to get access. Once you have identified or you're at an institution, you need to get an Epic user account. And so to start that process off, you can email the people listed here at each different facility. So at the Cleveland Clinic, it's Greg Horowitz. At Metro Health, it's Janine Leon. And at University Hospitals, it's Michael Baker. I'll give you an example. For the people at CASE, if you're trying to determine who you should partner with, first question to ask is, who is your clinical contact? And if it's at Metro, go with Metro. If it's at University Hospitals, go with University Hospitals, and likewise for the Cleveland Clinic. Once you email these people, they will help you through the process. It's slightly different at each institution, but in general, it follows these steps. You will need to get an Epic user account. After getting an Epic user account, you will sign up for an Epic user web account, which is simple. You just go to userweb.epic.com. And if you have an Epic account, that's a semi kind of automated process that takes less than a day. After you have a user web account, you can complete some of the online training. And the different hospitals have slightly different training that they want you to complete to use Cosmos. But the Epic Corporation themselves have some really good videos on the user web to basically learn how to start in Cosmos. After completing the training, you then get access to Cosmos. And so this process, depending on institution, if you already have an Epic account, for instance, it could be as short as 5 to 7 business days. If you don't have an Epic account, of course, it could take much longer. It could take, weeks, even up to a month. For instance, if you don't have an Epic user account and you need to complete research credentialing at one of these institutions, you can understand that that process could be very lengthy. So what we're advocating for is get started early. We want as many people with Cosmos accounts for the December datathon. So I'm going to go next and do a live demo of how to log in. The easiest way, if you're not familiar, is just go to userweb.epic.com, and this is the way I'm going to show. You can do show more, you click Cosmos, and then click access Cosmos. Once you're there, you're taken to this userweb.epic.com/topic/Cosmos. You can then just click access Cosmos. And I'm going to show you this. Long story short, once you get there, just bookmark it. And then it will be much easier. So we're going to slip over. I did an incognito window because if you don't, I log in kind of semi-automatically. You can find your institution. Of course, it's going to be Cleveland Clinic, Metro Health, or University Hospitals. I have access through Metro Health. So it asks, and you go to the single sign-on usually for your institution. And mine is going to be Metro. So I'll put that information in. It's going to take me right in, and you land on the user web. And this is where you want to go to show more, scroll down. Epic is vast, so there's tons of modules, tons of different people working in different groups. You'll find Cosmos. You can also star it. Once you're in Cosmos, it takes you to that link I had mentioned, userweb.epic.com/topic/Cosmos. Bookmark this, save it. Once you're bookmarked, you click it and it'll take you through that same process, single sign-on, but it'll open you up here, and then you just click Access Cosmos. This is going to take you to a two-factor authentication. They do allow, Epic Corporation allows pretty much most of the common authenticators, including Microsoft, Google, even Duo. I personally have the Google Authenticator. Drop in my numbers here. Verify, and this will take me right to the Cosmos portal dashboard. Welcome to Cosmos. And there it is. All right. And so Ashley's now going to take over and talk about creating dashboards and creating projects in Cosmos.
Absolutely. Thanks, Craig. So that landing page, your Welcome to Cosmos page, is going to have a few key features, but mostly what you see here on the right-hand side, where it says disease prevalence, patient sex and age, are dashboards. So you'll see that right now we are here looking at dashboards. These are screenshots from my Cosmos account that I've not necessarily personalized, but you can customize this by clicking on a particular dashboard of interest and looking through the catalog. So these are just some snapshots that Epic Cosmos team thought would be of interest to people. And so they created dashboards and have them on display. You can go ahead. Yeah, I've got a little demo here just so you can kind of see that the nice part about working in Epic Cosmos, they have a lot of features called Hover to Discover. So if you want some additional information about any of these dashboards, you just have to look at the little eye. Yeah, if you just hover over it. And so we can tell this is patient sex and age displayed within this dashboard. And you have components, or you're able to look at like some details related to what all is captured in that data. It will tell you where the data module it comes from, and a little bit of information about where that was pulled, as well as when the data was updated. So those are just using dashboards is not necessarily mandatory within Cosmos, unlike projects, which we'll talk about in just a second. But dashboards can be a really nice way. Like I said, you can customize what you see, whether it's create something that you save from your own analyses in order to get quick access to your work from a project, or if it's simply a topic of interest that you have, like say you're interested in hypertension or racial disparities in a particular area, you could kind of follow that topic and have that displayed in your Welcome to Cosmos dashboard page. Like I said, projects, though, are absolutely mandatory in order to access the slicer dicer features of Cosmos. So let's walk through where that is and what you need to do to create a project. So projects are here, right? We can still access this from our main landing page. And I've got some more screenshots from my Epic Cosmos account, which I have a few projects already listed. But when you're a new user, you won't see any projects listed. And instead of saying get started with something new, it will just say let's get started. But it'll still be that big green button. So once you click on the projects, then you click on let's get started. And that will take you over to a new page where you can enter your project information. So let's walk through that together then. So once we select the project page, right, that's going to be a little drop down. We're going to click on the get started with something new. And then it's going to ask you for a project title. So I'm just going to use a title related to today's research question, the queries that Craig will be walking us through. You just need to enter a very brief description. So I'm just going to put something like example of how to perform a basic or simple query in Cosmos. And then importantly, there are a few disclosures that Epic wants to know related to why you're doing this query. If you're not sure about whether your particular query meets a particular criteria, there is a little note where you can add a comment, and then the Epic team can actually email you back and help answer your questions. So like, for instance, if you're not sure if your query is related to a funded project, that could be an example of something you might want to ask Epic before you get started. Once we've created or selected a project we've created, then we're able to actually access that slicer dicer, the SD Explore tab that will bring us to data models. And that's where you really begin to perform your queries. But, before we get too ahead of ourselves, we're going to need to familiarize ourselves with what types of data are available and what data model should we go to in order to perform our queries? Where is this information located? So I'm going to turn that over to Craig, who's going to walk us through a little bit more on exactly how to find the data that you need to do your query.
Great, thanks, Ashley. So when you do the training for Cosmos, you'll learn a little bit about the data models, but they go very deep. So that training kind of scratches the surface. And we wanted to be able to show you where you go in the Cosmos portal to learn more about the underlying data. And so there's two key components to this. There's a data dictionary, and I'm going to do a live demo of that. It's very simple. You log in as I showed you before, and then you click the data dictionary. We're going to do that and dig down into some of the queries, the underlying data that we're planning to do today. And then there's a data encyclopedia. I'm going to jump right over from the data dictionary to the encyclopedia. The encyclopedia lives in what is called Galaxy, and you can go to galaxy.epic.com. That's where many of the underlying instructions and more information on not just Cosmos, but pretty much all of the Epic ecosystem where that underlying information lives. And so with that, we'll go right back over to our live demo. So I'm already logged in from before. And right up here at the top is Data Dictionary. We've discussed dashboards. We've discussed Slicer Dicer. The data science virtual machine we're not going to get into today, but I will just make one statement so you are aware of what it is. Most people, when they log in, they probably won't see this. This requires a bit of extra training. You can now do it virtually, but it's about 3 days of training, and you can get access to the underlying row level data. If you're familiar with SQL queries and you're a data analyst, that may be something that is worthwhile for you to do. I have to say, Slicer Dicer is evolving daily, and it's getting more powerful. So if you can't do something in Slicer Dicer, you probably will be able to do it in the future. And then lastly, to the data dictionary, which is where we're interested. And so just like really any data dictionary, this digs deep into every single underlying relational table that feeds Cosmos. And there are over 100 different tables in Cosmos. I'm going to focus on just one. And so we're going to show you a query later in a couple of minutes that takes into account differences in race and diagnoses that are different among races. And so if you just search for race, you can, you may not be familiar from the get-go, but you can definitely click into each of these. And again, you may have a different view. I have a couple of additional, for instance, these data marts, which you may not have access to. But the one that we want to focus on is the patient dim. And the patient dim is probably, if you could choose one table in Cosmos, it's probably one of the most important. It has one row for every patient in Cosmos. So 273 million probably right here. Actually 743. This is probably needs updated, but it goes into each variable, a description of the variable. As you can see down here, there's all the different uh, races as well as social vulnerability indices. And the reason this is getting a little bit into the weeds of Cosmos, but the reason we wanted to bring you here is you can't break it, so you can definitely play around and look around. But this column here is actually pretty important. If you're have an underlying question, research question, and you're having some trouble answering it in Slicer Dicer, you may need to, either do the training for the data science virtual machine or partner with somebody who has done that training. And that underlying data may be better visible in the data science virtual machine. This column here shows what is available in Slicer Dicer versus the data science virtual machine. And I mean, one key difference is the zip code. So postal code key, that's available in Slicer Dicer. We'll see, or when you're playing around in Slicer Dicer, you're unable to identify patients. And so Epic has done a very thorough job to make sure that the patient data is de-identified and safe. And so they've vetted that, so you can get down into the zip code and see that in Slicer Dicer. But if you have a really powerful machine like the data science virtual machine, and you can dig down into row level data, and you have zip code, and for some rare diseases, you may be able to start to identify those patients. So it was taken out of the data science virtual machine. Just like, and then on the other hand, there are other variables that are available in the data science virtual machine, which may not be available in Slicer Dicer. Here is one, the primary RUCA, that's the uh, rural urban um, commute area is commuting area. And so it has 10 different levels of codes, whether it's rural, urban, large urban, small rural. But that's available just in the data science virtual machine. All right, so that's enough about the data dictionary. Again, getting a little bit into the weeds, but feel free to, once you get access, to look at that. I'm going to go back to the main Welcome to Cosmos dashboard. This is the easiest way, I think, to get to the Cosmos Data Encyclopedia. You just go right over here and click. Before we go there, I want to just go to the Cosmos Learning Home. And we're not going to watch these or dig into them too deep, but there's a couple of great videos here, this really good training material. And so this is another good stop to look for how to learn how to use Cosmos. We're going to click on that data encyclopedia. It takes us to the Galaxy. And I'm already logged in, so it logged me into Galaxy as well. And so the encyclopedia, in contrast to the dictionary, gets into some more specifics about the underlying data. So it goes through some of the high hitting fields, and it will go through how that data was pulled from the underlying population, as well as some known biases and limitations. And so again, this is you'll have access to this once you get access to Cosmos. Here's some information about cancer staging, of course, very important. Also the known biases and limitation, and you can go through all of these. Very, very good resource, very thorough. Again, something you probably want to bookmark. All right, so that is the underlying data, how to learn more about the data in using the data dictionary and the data encyclopedia. I'll turn it back over to Ashley to discuss how to perform simple queries. Ashley's going to go through the theoretical part, and then I'll go through the live demo part.
Great. Thanks so much, Craig. So using the data dictionary and encyclopedia can help you using the data dictionary can help you identify what type of data model and where you might be able to access and kind of double check that you're able to actually perform your query of interest in Slicer Dicer. And then, that data dictionary doesn't have the specific definition of what the data means. So then you have to kind of flip over to the encyclopedia if you want to be sure that, yes, this is the type of race variable that I'm going to need for my query. So for today's walkthrough and examples that Craig will be performing live, we have two overarching research questions. The first is, what was the prevalence of hypertension in adults by race in the US from July 2017 through June 2024? And the second being, what was the trend in prevalence of hypertension in adults by race in the US from July 2017 through June 2024 by year and by quarter? So there are multiple components that we'll need to dissect from this research question that relate to the terms and the types of inputs and modifications that we'll need to actually add to perform our query in Cosmos. So the key terms that I want to make sure that we cover are really, I like the term, and I think Craig likes the term, population criteria. EPIC will refer to this as just criteria. But when you think about a data model, you're going to ask yourself, what type of data am I interested in querying? So this could be encounters, this could be medications, this could be procedures, but that's going to determine, kind of what your base N is calculated off of. Your population criteria or your criteria help you basically identify what types of people or procedures you want to include in your analysis. So that could be based off of demographic information. That could be based off of their diagnosis or diagnoses they've had in the past. Slices will enable you to create subgroups for the purposes of better understanding your data as divided by a certain variable, such as date or demographic. And you can also do comparisons once you've created subgroups as well, and be able to kind of make those direct comparisons that way. Your measures, so Cosmos is going to default to a frequency count of just whatever criteria you've input, right? So the default is just a straightforward N. However, there are a number of measures that you can choose from, depending on what's going to help you answer your research question. Some of these include like means, odds ratios, percentages, and we'll take a closer look at that in a minute when Craig does the walkthrough. Another term that is important to note, right? We mentioned in the beginning that Cosmos is longitudinal, right? That there is data available for many patients over time. And so there may be times you want to restrict your queries to a particular time range, or even look at trends over time. So we'll be doing both of those to help answer our research questions. So just to remind you, when we begin accessing Slicer Dicer, it asks you before you can even enter the Slicer Dicer session, what type of data model you want to query. And really, when you're selecting that initial data model, you're in some ways setting your initial criteria of what type of population are you interested in querying. So this could be anything from hospital admissions. You may just want to look at pregnancies, people who have had pregnancies, and then you can sort of isolate, looking at doing queries specifically focused on that. You may have a research question that's more related to encounters, in terms of number of encounters that happen in a certain area, or medications prescribed by encounter. It really just depends on your research question. But the most frequently accessed, in my opinion, data model would be patients. So that allows us to get a count of, or be able to better examine the patients within Cosmos. So if you recall from our research question, we did want to select patients who were diagnosed with hypertension who were adults. So we would select then the patient data model. And as part of our population criteria, we would narrow this down to just look at adults who have hypertension. We're not interested necessarily in pediatric hypertension based on our research question. So slices, as I mentioned, allow you to create subgroups. Again, this is going to be based on however your research question is framed. So our particular research question is looking at disease prevalence by race. So we'll really want to add race as a demographic variable to look at the breakdown, to be able to look at side-by-side comparisons of how many people by race are diagnosed with hypertension. You can go to the next slide. So your measures are really your outcomes of interest. So, it's going to default to having a frequency count in Cosmos, but there are a number of different measures that you can select from. And it all, again, boils down to a research question. Sometimes it is helpful to look at percentages. You can also specify in your measures that you really want percentage of patients who have a diagnosis of hypertension within your measures. So that's also what we're going to be walking through with Craig to help us answer our research questions. I'm sorry, could you go back to dates? Yep. So you'll want to set, a start date and end date. Again, this is based on our particular research question for the example, that we'll want to set this for July 2017 through June 2024. And we actually, for the second research question, are going to create, right? Like that research question had a question about what does this look like over by quarter or by year? So we can actually slice by date in order to look at these trends over time. So that would be another slice that we can create in our basic query example. Go ahead.
Great. I think I'm taking over now, Ashley, and I just wanted to point out one thing that may be a little confusing, and it's highlighted here, is the slices, if you're looking between groups, is in the slices part of Cosmos Slicer Dicer. Specifically, if you're focused on date, there's a slice by in the date section. So subtle difference, but and I'll show that when we go to the live demo here. All right, so just to remind everyone what our research questions were, and these are super simple, I think important, but easy to kind of recreate in Cosmos, and the type of questions. This is a kind of a chip shot. You can do very sophisticated research questions using additional features, which are going to show in the November webinar, looking at sequential criteria. So if something has to follow something, or looking at super complex if-then logic. So if 1 and 2, but not 3 and 4, you can get pretty fancy. We're not doing that today. But the research questions we posed, just to get everyone kind of up to par on the basics, is what was the prevalence of hypertension in adults by race in the US from July 2017 through June 2024? And then we wanted to look at that same question, but what was the trend by year and by quarter? And so this is how you would perform that query in Cosmos. Again, I'm already logged in. This is the landing page. You can change the landing page if you want, but I just leave it here. As Ashley mentioned, you do have to pick a project. So I'm just going to pick our example, and then you click Slicer Dicer. It's going to take us into the Slicer Dicer portal. And there's always a little bit of anxiety with live demos, but it seems to be running pretty clean here today. So remember back to our research question, we wanted to look at patients in the US with hypertension. Well, since Epic Cosmos has a very good representation of US patients, that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with just the patients. This pops up. I'm going to skip the tutorial, but there's a ton of training. If you hit here, if you look at tutorials, you can dig into those tutorials. And so this is great. I mean, so here we have almost 274 million patients. and we only have this one population criteria up here. Again, you can always hover to discover, and it will give you a little bit more information using these pop-ups. And the next criteria that we want to add, remember we wanted to focus on adults. And so there's a couple of ways to do that. You can search for criteria here, or you can hit this pop-up. It's one and the same. It just gives you a different interface. And so we're going to search for age. We'll give it a second. All right. And you can feel free. There's all kinds of, I mean, just look at the differences, but there are some already made. So persons age 17 and younger, that could be one you would use. We're going to set this just blank age one so that we can define the criteria. Now, before I do this, I want to show you one relatively new feature of Cosmos, which really is nice. So we're currently at almost 274 million patients. I had mentioned before, you can imagine, and if you have some underlying knowledge of SQL, these joins and these queries can take some time. And not only that, the Epic team is very facile, and they have done a great job in modifying these queries to get the most efficiency out of them. Even so, they take some time. And so one feature is if you hit this, take a sneak peek, this gives you a representative sample of patients in Cosmos. So we went from 274 million, basically, we're now at 200 million or 2.7 million. So the query is going to run much faster. When we're done, we've worked out everything that we're, finished, and we think we have the query we want. You simply uncheck this box, and then it digs deep and does the query. But it updates in real time. So if you don't check this, take a sneak peek, it's going to try and run the query with every single change you make. So I think that was a great feature. I think it was brilliant by the Cosmos team. And so we had age. I just changed it now from all ages to 18 and above. And if you're unsure, it says here, so we have all patients in Cosmos. That's our base. That's the base data model. And then we added population criteria of age in years, and we set it to 18 years or more. So this is patients in the US, and this is now patients in the US who are adults. I am going to skip the slices section just for a moment, because sometimes I think it's cleaner to look at the measures first. So what are we looking at? If you think of your table one in most manuscripts, you usually have your groups, right? And you have the demographics, the underlying demographics that you want. And so if you think of the table one, just collapse your groups into one kind of all patients. And that's what we're doing. To get back to the by group or between groups, we'll add a slice at a later time here. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to hit the measure. And if we go back to our research question, we wanted to know what is the prevalence of hypertension. And so to ask that in kind of a mathematical way, it is what is the percentage with a selected value. So there's all these different options. Again, we're not getting into any of them other than this one today, but we want to know what is the percentage of total patients that have a diagnosis of hypertension. And so if you hit percentage with selected value, you can dig down and find the one you're searching for. You can also just search. And so I know I want a diagnosis of hypertension. And so I can just put in diagnosis. All right. And all these options come up. It kind of puts the most popular at the top. These aren't quite fully alphabetical, but it does put, and so the one that we're focused on in diagnoses alone, you can look at just the build diagnoses, you can look at clinical diagnoses, you can look, and so we're just going to say we want any diagnosis, doesn't matter how it came into the Epic system, and so we're going to look at all diagnoses. So we're going to start with percentage with the diagnosis. We now we're building a new measure. And so here is where you actually put the diagnosis of interest. And so we had said hypertension. And if anyone out there has done work with ICD codes, you are going to love this feature. So this feature where you just put in hypertension, again, it sorts it very, I think, intelligently, where the most common things you want are probably at the top. And of course, it's the first one here. So we're going to hit hypertension, and we're going to hit accept. And what I had mentioned before about all these ICD codes, where did they go? And so we just have hypertension. Like, what does that mean? And so if you hit this and Epic has what are called groupers. These are used operationally in Epic, and they're used in Cosmos. I mean, there's no reason to change it if it's not broken. So if you open that grouper, you can see that this one hypertension grouper contains 1,983 different ICD codes. And so you can definitely scroll through them. You can choose them. You can uncheck and make your own new grouper. So you can save as a new grouper. Um, and you can, this saves you all that work of what ICD-10 codes do I need? What ICD-9 codes do I need? Or who has what? It does all that kind of dirty work for you. And they're very accurate. These are the same groupers that are used operationally. So there's not, I mean, again, as people start to publish in Cosmos, I think this is a huge feature. Let's say that we just wanted to focus on essential hypertension, probably the most. So we could simply change that to essential hypertension and, look, it's not too far down here, but here's essential hypertension. Again, ICD-10, it's I-10 period and star. That means any ICD code that begins with I-10. If you're familiar with kind of SQL queries and stars, what they mean for regular expressions, this is any code that starts with I-10 and ends with whatever else. And so we could pick that, and then that would now be, again, it's not a big change, right? But let's go back, and again, you can also dig into this grouper and see, now you can see that there's just in essential hypertension, there's 238 different codes that fill that one diagnosis. So I'm going to go back just to hypertension, just to, it doesn't really matter, but. And we're going to use all 1,983 ICD codes. We see that in this population, again, this is a snippet of Cosmos, we have a 20.6% prevalence of hypertension in patients in the US who are adults during this date, in between these dates. And so the next thing then we can focus on is changing the dates. And so super simple, just click them, start date, end date. We said we wanted to do July 1st of 2017. We're going to do 7-year period. We're going to go through June 30th of 2024. Nice clean 7 years. Let that think a moment. And it's going to now recalculate. It's not going to change much, right? Because we're overlapping the time period we had before. We just wanted to get a nice clean 7 years for our future. We want to look at the trends. So again, 23%, I mean, it's changed a little bit, and you'll see why it went up a touch, I think, in the next couple of questions. And so it's really nice to toggle between these. That's a new measure we added. You can name that measure. So if we click back here, you can give it a custom name, which is kind of nice. You can name it whatever you want. The other thing you can turn it off, and you can go back to just the number of patients. So you have to have one active. And so if, like, for instance, if I keep that one as the number of patients and I untoggle this, then it untoggles this one. So you have to have one measure active at all times. And if it's not one you enter, it's going to be the number of patients. So going back to our research question, so what was the prevalence of hypertension in adults by race in the US from July 2017 through June 2024? So we're almost there. We need to look at this by race. And so that is just screaming slice, slice, slice. And so if you click here, you can do race. And I've already done this. So I'm going to, if you haven't done this before, you could simply grab the top 10. Let's say, I don't know, there are 10 races in Cosmos? Probably not. If you could if there's actually only 6. So if you say grab top 10 and there's only 6, it's just going to grab the top 6. But you can change this. You can grab top 3. I'm going to click the search icon here and kind of do this a little bit manually to show you how it works. And so I've already done this. I know that I want a nice graph that looks pretty and it kind of increasing prevalence. I think this is well documented in the literature that, Asians typically have lower rates or lower prevalence of hypertension. So we're going to start there. Again, it's doing these queries in real time, and I limited it to a subset so that it runs a bit faster. We have what's called sneak peek on there. You can see it. And it takes a little bit of time. So I'll let that one run. And then we're also going to do, and it will run. This is why sometimes, the live demos are a little risky during a webinar, but we'll let it keep running. Okay. Just thinking I'm
And
going to
Greg,
keep
I
adding
just wanted to take this time to point out, I think the there are a few questions in the chat. I'm responding to some of them, but there's one in particular by Gang Chen about being able to download complete data from Cosmos that I thought you might be able to. Yeah, I believe you're stuck even with the data science feature of using their interface. Um,
and so
elaborate on that.
yeah, that's a great question. You can, and we're not going to show you how to do it today. We're going to set that as a teaser for the next webinar where we're going to actually export some data. So you can export data, and it's basically in a tabulated form from Slicer Dicer. It's right here. And so you can copy the graph. If we change this, I'm not going to because it changes, kind of throws off the rhythm of what we're trying to show. But you can get a cross tab, and it's a table, a cross table, and you can export that to CSV. And so we're going to show that. You can import that into R and fill in the missing spaces and kind of do some pretty neat things. For the data science virtual machine, you cannot export uh, discrete row level data. You can export anything you would potentially need for a manuscript. So any table, any figures that you create, there's a process to get that out of the data science virtual machine and into your hands so that you can publish it, but no row level data can be taken out. So we finished our query. I have it what looks in pretty nice. It's kind of increasing prevalence among the different races. I'm going to get rid of none of the above, and none of the above, you can hover over these and it will highlight that one. But none of the above is patients who just don't have a race listed in Cosmos. So we're going to drop those and see what it looks like. And this will be kind of, I think we're answering our first question right here. And so the first question, if we go back, what was the prevalence of hypertension in adults by race in the US from July through June? I think that shows it right there. And so that is pretty good picture. And so we're going to continue to work on this and try and answer our second question. And so our second question is the same thing, except what was the trend over those years and or quarters? And so that's really easy. We can go right here. Again, this is what I had mentioned before. It makes a lot of sense to have the slice by date here rather than a slice up here. But just know that they're the same term, right? So if we're going to slice by a date, you do it in the dates. Any other slices are in the slices part. And so if we pick this, you can choose really anything you want. I'm going to choose year. We'll let that continue to work. We're almost done here. And you can probably think of what's going to happen. Yeah, that's not ideal. So that is in fact the truth. But that is not really helpful, right? And so there are better ways to visualize the data, of course. And so why don't we try a line graph? Now we're getting somewhere. So now you can hover over these and you can actually see, if you pick, and when you export this, it will put in the different colors for you in a legend. But you can see that not only are the prevalence, it not only is the prevalence of hypertension different among races, something's going on. So it's increasing pretty substantially. It just blew right through COVID and, barely even a dip. Let's see if we can look a little bit closer at that. And remember, Cosmos is very rich in data. Even with this is a sneak peek. So we don't even have the gamut here. And so let's go to quarter. Wow. And that's by over 7 years by quarter, what is going on with hypertension, right? In every race, it is just slamming through. It went right through COVID, maybe a little bit of a dive there when patients weren't being seen. But that's kind of an interesting outcome. And so we're gonna end here. We have about 10 minutes of questions. The last thing I just want to highlight is again, a plug for our future big data webinars. I did see a question in the chat from Dia. Yes, we're going to share this presentation. We can share the slides. And this is our first quarterly webinar. So there aren't any other ones to show you, but we will definitely continue these and post them and share them. Stay tuned to your emails. But the next one, again, is going to be on the 13th. I believe an email already went out, or it's going to this week, and there'll be subsequent emails. But we're going to get into the complex queries, looking at longitudinal data. There's things I mentioned. If something has to follow something else, if something can't come before, super advanced logic, you can do all of that and right in Slicer Dicer. The data visualization, so we're going to dig deeper into that. Pie charts, they do have stacked bar charts where you can look, better at percentages within populations. There's another feature called background query processing, which is kind of a set it and forget it, for lack of a better, and you can just save the query. You can actually then go to another query and come back to that query once it's done, because these can be long. And it's not, I mean, Epic has a ton of resources. It's not a compute problem. It's not a CPU or a GPU problem. It's literally digging through, 274 million rows of data and doing the joins as well. And so that's a great feature. And then we'll get into how to export data, tables, and figures. We may dip into just a little bit how you can take a crosstab and put it into Python and R and make it a full kind of 273 million row data frame. Sometimes impossible to do in R, but definitely you can do it in Python. And then another plug for our first multi-institutional Epic Cosmos Datathon. Stay tuned to your email for that. It's going to be at CASE. The next big data webinar will be sometime in the first quarter, and stay tuned.
Great,
All right.
thanks,
That
Craig.
takes
Just to direct your attention. Oh, I'm sorry. Was somebody else also asking questions? I was just going to direct you to the chat and wanting to make sure that I was fully answering Ken's question. Ken's question is about the queries, whether or not people, if you're querying between 2021 and 2024, is it just about people who are alive at that time that's specified? Or would it just sort of pull anyone's data that was collected during that time? So I mentioned the, base filter and that there are some additional things you have to do, but I didn't know if you wanted to elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, and I'm happy we can even go back and I can, we can play around with the actual live demo since it's working so well. The yes, and so that was Ken who asked the question, correct?
Yes, Ken. Mhm.
Yeah, so Ken, great question. Yes, it pulls everyone. And so that is a really important piece, and we're trying to keep it simple, right, for the webinar. But let's say you just wanted people who are alive. And so there's a patient status, and you can, if you don't know, you can of course just do the search, but there's a patient status, alive or deceased, and that is, here we go. Let's say we just wanted to focus on the people who are living.
Mhm.
That's a kind of a complex question because, okay, if the deceased people, how are they in this data set if they have a diagnosis? Um, that's a loaded question. There's a ton. The Galaxy, the data encyclopedia goes into the deaths and how that date is calculated, how accurate it is. Some of that is a huge limitation, but that is a feature you can do here. Is you can just simply add another criteria. And again, the criteria, the population criteria, really think of it as if you were to define a study group and you were to state or write out your inclusion exclusion criteria, that's what you're going to want to put in this population criteria. You can think of it just the same way. I'm not going to do it here, but you could, well, we can do it. Why not? We could do, if you want to flip this to exclude, so now we're excluding adults. We can assume it's children. This could be another way, it's just like when you're building a study, is it an inclusion criteria or is it an exclusion criteria? Or is it both? It's kind of both. You only define it once. So you say adults, you don't in the exclusion say no children or and so that's the same thing that we're doing here, but that's as easy as flipping this include versus exclude. So really good question.
Yeah, there are a few more questions in the chat. I think some of them are really great. Sam has a couple of questions. So he's interested in knowing the date when something was collected, and this is specific to promise measures, promise patient reported outcomes. So it's kind of a specific question. I said sort of in general, you can tell when Cosmos has updated a particular, because that's going to be the date that Cosmos is going to be the most familiar with, that's going to be easier to access, is like when it was last updated in Cosmos. But do you know if this sort of information would need to know when the promise measures were collected to look at longitudinal changes? And so quality of life was given as an example. That
So
may require going to the data dictionary, honestly. Excuse me.
so the question, and if you're out there and you want to jump on the screen, feel free. But the question as I'm trying to find it here in the chat, it's a little bit full, is you need to know the specific data promise measure was captured because of something related to the year or something related to the age of the patient.
So this would be more, someone starts treatment and they have a certain pain interference, right? You want to know how they're doing. If those measures are collected from a clinic over and over and over again, like say every couple months, and you wanted to compare cohorts, for example, you'd have to have a date related to a value or an approximate date related to a value to look at longitudinal changes.
Yes, so I'm not exactly sure about promise measures, but that's a great question to dig into the data dictionary. I will say that, and this gets back to the underlying architecture of Epic, whether something is called what's record-based or contact-based. And so if something is record-based, like a patient's age, that doesn't really change. If something's contact-based, like it happens every encounter, uh, there's multiple of those. And so Cosmos does have some contact base, meaning longitudinal data over time. But I will give you one example where it doesn't, and the team, at least when we've talked with them before, they're working on this. So they do have, and this is another huge plug, uh, they do have over now 10 million patient-reported outcomes for social drivers of health. That's going to explode this year with the Final Rule 2023 instituted by CMS. That specific variable, the social driver of health, is a contact-based record, meaning it's over time, it's asked and it's repeated, and so there are multiple measures of social drivers of health over time for a specific patient in individual healthcare systems Epic, Chronicles database. What Cosmos currently does for social drivers of health and for the SVI, the geolocated data, is it takes the most recent. So it really depends on the variable. There are some contact based with multiple measures. For instance, something else that would be contact based, meaning every encounter, would be like vital signs. So there are vital signs over time. If I had to guess, I would probably say promise measure would be more similar to the social drivers of health, which are the most recent. And so that is, again, and once you're a part of this group, there is you can jump on Galaxy and you can vote for additional features. And the Cosmos team is very, they wanna build this, and they'll pay attention. You can vote on, and so if that's something you're adamant about, definitely post it and then see what others think. But that is the direction they're moving. Great question.
There is one question Peter had. Could this be an artifact? I'm not sure exactly what this is referring to. Could this be an artifact of the rising number of patients in Cosmos? I know it's looking at the percent encounters with a hypertension diagnosis, but you could compare it to the percent encounters with some other diagnosis, e.g. Z00.00 preventative visit. if Z00.00 is increasing too, then it's some sort of secular trend.
Yes, great question, Dr. Greco. I saw that one.
Yeah,
Yes.
it is
You can
great.
actually, and if you want, I can show you how you can actually do this in Cosmos. So you can, I'm not going to do it now because this is the basics level, but that's a great question. There's probably a multitude of reasons why this trend is what it is, but that is definitely one part of it. And so it's not just that we're all eating more red meat. I think that's probably the opposite. So, but you can create populations by the patient model and link it to encounters using this right here. So link to, if you define a patient population, you can then link that to encounters. And so definitely not a basics move, but it's possible. Great point.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some, as you're like, depending on your level of familiarity, not just with data science, but also with ICD codes, there are some ways that you can sort of add some quality controls to your specific queries. I'm just trying to see, I think, Sam, did that answer your question? I know you had a couple of them. I just want to make sure that was all, that resolved your answer. And I know, yeah, that resolved your question. Okay, perfect, great. And then Lily had a quick question about building dashboards as needed in Cosmos like Tableau. Like, is it like Tableau? And I just said, they kind of have their own proprietary way of doing things in Epic. It's not quite the same, but you can think of it as fairly similar. It's just you have to select components. I don't know if you, I know you and I aren't huge fans of personalizing dashboards, but
Yes, Lily, you can absolutely create custom dashboards. It's super simple. Any slicer dicer session, you can save it. You can name it whatever you want. You can put them into kind of folders. If you think of like the Microsoft, the Windows architecture, it's similar to that. And so you can, I don't think there's a limit on the number of slicer dicer sessions you can have. And then what you can do is you can take your own custom dashboard and you can drop in, I could drop in that slicer dicer session right here as a component of the dashboard. And so you can do as many as you want. You can create custom this scrolls and indefinitely. So absolutely you can do all that. Remember that this though is Cosmos data. They do have a new feature in Slicer Dicer where you can actually I'm affiliated with I got access through Metro. I'm a Metro Health Informatics fellow, but I'm 100% at UH. You can look at the data in your own institution as well. And so if you have a query that you really like, there's a button you click and you can look at just your own institutional data. And it knows what institution you're at. So it takes care of that for you. Yep.
And I got a specific question sort of message to me, and I'm just dropping that in the chat so that people are able to access that information in case they have the same question. So the question was, does this include outpatient data? And the answer is yes, absolutely. If your question is specific or you're only interested in outpatient data, there are ways to narrow down your search. But that's, but just to simply answer that question, it's all outpatient. I know we're a little past time, so thanks everyone for hanging on. I'm just trying to scroll through the chat. Are there any questions that haven't been answered yet? I've just been trying to get through these, and I'm glad there's so much engagement.
Can patients have more than one race? Yes, Dr. Barshane. I think Epic holds up to 6 races. You actually would probably know this better than I, but the race listed in Cosmos, and that's go back to the data dictionary in Slicer Dicer is one race, but if you dig into the data science virtual machine, you get all races. And so again, really important point. Great question.
Yeah, so that's why you need to look at the data dictionary to see, what are you able to query with Slicer Dicer. And if you're working on your virtual machine access, you're going to be able to do a lot more granular queries. But if you're really interested in getting at like zip code level data, you're going to need to stick with Slicer Dicer. But regional and regional level questions, of course, can be answered in virtual machine. All right.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Stay tuned. We simply scratched the surface. There's so much you can do. I cannot speak highly of Cosmos and the work that Dr. Kelber, this is his brainchild, has done over the years to get this to fruition. Really amazing work. Thank you, guys. Feel free to email me and Ashley if you have any questions.
Thanks. Yes.
Thanks. I'll hang on if anyone has a burning question.